Montana 1873. The auction hall smelled like pine resin and something that couldn't be taken back. 60 men, one woman standing on a platform. The laughter started before she even found a place to look. Nobody bid, not at $100, not at $50, not at $25. The clock ticked. A man in an expensive vest watched from the front row with the patient expression of someone who already knew how this ended. His pocket watch caught the lamplight and threw it back. Outside, the first snow of the season was deciding whether to fall. Then a voice from the back corner cut through the silence like a blade through cold iron. $2. The room turned. The laughter that followed was louder than before. The man in the expensive vest stopped smiling. He was already calculating what came next. Clearwater Bend, Montana territory. October 1873. The auction hall smelled like pine resin and bad decisions. Jude Calloway stood in the back corner with his hat pulled low and $2 silver burning a hole in his shirt pocket. $2. His last $2. The ones he'd set aside for cornmeal, for the month, for surviving the kind of winter that didn't ask permission before it killed you. He wasn't supposed to be here, except he was. Because the mail-order bride introduction ceremony was the only place in 40 miles where a man could stand among other human beings without having to explain himself, without having to answer for the state of his roof or the size of his debt, or the particular way loneliness had started to feel like a second skin he couldn't scrape off no matter how hard he worked. So he stood. He watched. He kept his hands in his pockets and his mouth shut, and he reminded himself that he was only here for the company of other people breathing the same air. Not for anything else. Not for anything that cost money he didn't have. The hall held maybe 60 men, ranchers, miners, a few shopkeepers in from town, and Harlan Doss sitting in the front row like he owned the place, which he nearly did. Doss had arrived before anyone else and chosen the center seat with a kind of deliberateness that communicated ownership without a single word. His vest was the gray of expensive wool. His pocket watch caught the lamplight and threw it back. He sat with one leg crossed over the other and he surveyed the room the way a man surveys acreage he's already decided to buy. When Doss's eyes swept to the back corner, they found Jude the way a hawk finds a rabbit. The corner of Doss's mouth moved. Not quite a smile, more like a notation, something filed away for later use. Jude looked at the floor. The introduction ceremony was not legally an auction. Silas Pruitt, the territorial agent who ran these proceedings, was very clear about that. He said it at the beginning of every session, reading from the same dog-eared card, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who'd said the same words too many times. This was an introduction, a meeting of interested parties. Any financial arrangement between a man and a woman was a gesture of good faith, a commitment to the serious nature of the undertaking, nothing more. Everyone in the room understood exactly what it was. 5 women had traveled 2,000 miles from the east. 5 women who'd read the notices in the paper. Who'd weighed their options and found them wanting. Who'd made the kind of calculation that women in 1,873 sometimes had to make. The hall watched them the way it watched everything, with the particular attention of men who had decided something was theirs to evaluate. The first woman went to the banker from Clearwater Bend for $300. She had smooth hands and a smile that arrived quickly, the smile of someone who'd learned early that it was a useful tool. The banker shook Pruitt's hand and looked pleased with himself. The second went for $250, the third for $200, the fourth for $175, the fifth for $150, and the man who claimed her had the look of someone who'd gotten more than he expected. Then Pruitt cleared his throat with the sound of a man preparing for something unpleasant. "We have one more this evening." His voice had changed, the salesman's cadence gone out of it. "Number 6, Miss Ruth Corley, from Abilene, Texas." She stepped up onto the platform, and the hall went absolutely, completely, devastatingly silent. For 3 full seconds, which felt longer, which felt like the kind of silence that had weight to it, texture, the kind you could press your thumb into. Then the laughter started. Ruth Corley was 6 feet and 2 inches of woman standing in a calico dress that had given up trying to fit her somewhere around the wrists and the shoulders. The dress was blue-green, the color of sage after rain, and it ended 2 inches too high at her cuffs and pulled too tight across the breadth of her back. Her hair was dark blonde, twisted and pinned at the base of her neck with the efficiency of someone who'd never had time to care about hair. Her boots were square-toed, work-worn, the leather creased at the ball of the foot from years of standing on hard ground. She was built the way Montana was built, not decorative, functional. Every part of her designed for purpose, for endurance, for the particular kind of labor that didn't stop when it was inconvenient. She stepped onto the platform and she stood there, and she looked at a point somewhere above the heads of the crowd, and she put her hands behind her back. From the back corner, Jude could see what the rest of the hall probably couldn't from their angle. Her hands. She'd laced her fingers together behind her back, and the knuckles had gone white, that was all. No other sign. Just the knuckles. Just the white of them against the dim lamplight. Just the evidence of a person holding themselves very still from the inside while the outside received the full weight of 60 men finding her funny. Pruitt tried. Give him credit for trying. Miss Cawley is 26 years of age. She can read and write. She has practical skills. She's traveled from Texas and she's built like a barn. Someone in the middle of the hall. Laughter spiked and rolled. Does she come with land to get that big? Pruitt, you sure that's not a man in a dress? Pruitt held up a hand. Gentlemen. The word did no work at all. If we could good for Pruitt. Pulling plows? Jude's right hand moved into his pocket and closed around the $2 He didn't decide to do it. His hand just went there. Some older reflex. Something that predated reason. Ruth Cawley did not look down at the floor. She was not going to give them. Jude could see it in the set of her jaw, the precise stillness of her neck, the way she'd chosen a point above everyone's head, and she was looking at it with the concentration of a woman doing arithmetic. She was counting something. Probably heartbeats. Probably the seconds until this was over. He'd counted seconds like that before. In a wheat field in Pennsylvania, watching smoke rise above the ridge, listening to sounds he didn't have names for yet. Pruitt tried again. Shall we start at 100, gentlemen? $100. Nothing. The hall wasn't laughing now. It had moved past laughter into something more uncomfortable. The particular discomfort of people who've been part of something cruel and are now watching the cruelty become undeniable. Men who'd been laughing 30 seconds ago were now studying their boots. 75. Nothing. The clock on the wall ticked. Someone shifted their weight. The lamplight swayed in a draft from the north-facing window and made all the shadows lean at once. 50. Ruth's shoulders changed. Not a collapse, not a flinch. Smaller than that. Some infinitesimal compression, like a piece of wood giving under a load that's been building for a long time. Her jaw stayed set, her hands stayed white behind her back. But something in the line of her shoulders registered each silence as what it was. Which was an answer. Which was 60 men in a room deciding one by one that she was worth nothing. 25. Pruitt's voice had gone nearly inaudible. Jude's fingers closed around the $2. The cornmeal money. The surviving the winter money, the absolute last of it. He thought, this is insane. He thought, I cannot do this. He thought, Smart hasn't gotten me anywhere. Smart lost me everything 3 years ago when Ellen looked at me with something that wasn't even anger, just exhaustion. Just a quiet certainty that waiting for things to get better had run out on her. He thought, I have $2 and a dying ranch and no earthly right to complicate either of our lives. Then Ruth Cawley looked up. Not at the crowd, not at Pruitt. Across the hall, over the heads of 60 men, to the back corner where Jude Calloway stood with his hat pulled low and his hand around $2. It lasted maybe 1 second, maybe less. And in that second he saw something in her face that he hadn't expected and couldn't name properly, but recognized the way you recognize a landscape you've never visited but dreamed about. It wasn't hope exactly. It was the shape of hope inside a person who'd stopped letting themselves have it. The outline of it, the impression it left after it was gone. He said $2. His voice carried the way sounds carry in a room that's already gone quiet. Sharp and clear and final. 60 heads turned toward the back corner. Pruitt's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Harlan Doss in the front row turned in his seat. He looked at Jude with an expression that wasn't surprise. It was something more considered than surprise. Something that said he was already several moves ahead of this moment and finding it useful. The laughter that came next was different from the laughter before. Louder. Bigger. The release of men who'd been holding something uncomfortable and now had somewhere to put it. Someone's tin cup hit the floor and skittered under a bench and nobody picked it up. $2. Did he say $2? Hell, I wouldn't give $2 for a broke-down mule. Calloway's finally lost what was left. Jude walked through it. Through the laughter, through the parting crowd, through the lamplight and the tobacco smoke and the 60 men who found him funny. He walked to Pruitt's table and he put the $2 down and they made a sound. A solid double clink against the wood. And he said, is that sufficient for your purposes? Or do I need to find more? Pruitt stared at the coins. He looked at them. He looked at Ruth, still standing on the platform with her hands still locked behind her back and her eyes now moving, now coming down from that fixed point above the crowd and landing on Jude Calloway with an expression he couldn't fully read from this angle. Wary. Calculating. Waiting to understand what this was, Mr. Calloway. Pruitt gestured helplessly at the hall. This is highly irregular, so is auctioning human beings. Jude picked up the pen, but here we are. 2 or 3 of the laughs in the room died mid-breath. Uncomfortable truth did that, made people swallow. Pruitt looked at the crowd one more time. One last effort. Any other interested parties? Any at all? The silence that answered was the loudest thing in the room. Sold. Pruitt said it quietly, like he was admitting something. To Jude Calloway for $2. God help you both. The contract was standard territorial language. Jude read it twice because he always read things twice, and because the language in the 3rd paragraph made his stomach turn slightly, and he wanted to be sure he'd understood it correctly. He had. The words were what they were. He signed where Pruitt indicated and straightened and held the pen out toward Ruth. She'd come down from the platform. She was standing 3 feet from him, which was closer than he'd been yet, and she was taller than she'd appeared on the platform, which was already tall. She looked at the pen with the expression of a woman deciding whether to pick up something that might bite. You need to sign, Jude told her. If you want to. If I want to. Her voice was low and measured, carrying the flatness of the Texas plains in it. A particular kind of economy with words that came from growing up somewhere. The silence was so big that sound felt like a commitment. That's an interesting way to put it. You don't have to. If you'd rather take your chances in town, I won't hold you to this. My chances in town. She looked past him at the hall, at the men who were dispersing now, losing interest since the entertainment was over. Yes. My many other options. She took the pen. Her hand didn't shake, which he noticed because most people's hands shook when they were signing something they hadn't planned to sign. Her signature was large and clear and angular. Ruth Anna pause. Then Calloway added after it. The letters slightly smaller. Slightly more deliberate. As if she'd had to make a separate decision. Just like that, she was his wife. Outside, the October air was a cold fist after the close heat of the hall. The sun was already low and going lower, painting the dust of Main Street in shades of amber that made everything look better than it was. This was something Montana did in October, made itself beautiful right before it tried to kill you. Jude's wagon was at the hitching post. Birch, his mule, was doing what Birch always did, which was stand with his eyes mostly closed in an attitude of profound philosophical resignation. Ruth's trunk was in the wagon bed, already loaded, a single battered rectangle of leather-bound wood that held the whole of what she'd brought from Texas. It didn't take up much space. Jude reached up to help her onto the seat. She climbed up herself, without looking at him. Not rudely. Just the movement of a person who'd been helping themselves onto wagon seats for 26 years and saw no reason to change the arrangement now. He untied Birch and climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins. Birch sighed the sigh of an animal who'd expected exactly this. They hadn't gone a quarter mile when Harlan Doss pulled his black horse alongside them. Doss rode the way he did everything else, with the ease of a man who'd never been hurried by anything because nothing moved faster than he did. His horse was glossy and well-fed in a county where most animals were lean from the work they did. The contrast wasn't accidental. Calloway. Doss's voice was the voice he used when he wanted to sound friendly, which was different from his actual voice in ways that Jude had learned to identify over years of negotiation. Heard you made quite the purchase this afternoon. Doss. $2. Doss shook his head with the practiced sadness of a man performing admiration. Have to respect the economy of it. His eyes moved to Ruth. He looked at her the way he looked at parcels of land, appraisingly, as though calculating what she was worth broken down into components. Ma'am, welcome to Montana. Ruth looked at him the way she'd looked at the pen. Thank you, she said, and there was nothing in her voice at all, which was its own kind of answer. Just wanted to remind you, Doss said, back to Jude now, back to the friendly voice, that your lease payment comes due in 90 days. $600. I imagine with recent expenditures, he gestured vaguely in Ruth's direction with 2 fingers. You'll want to start planning early. Jude's hands tightened on the reins. Birch felt it and shifted nervously. I'm aware of the date. Of course you are. Doss studied the tree line to the north, the ridge where the old growth pine started. The ridge that was the actual subject of every conversation he and Jude had ever had. Beautiful timber up there. Shame to lose access to it. Offer still stands at $500 for the whole parcelish. You could take your wife somewhere with better prospects. He tipped his hat. Think about it. He wheeled his horse and was gone with the unhurried ease of a man who knew he'd be back. Silence. The wagon rolled. The dust settled. Ruth said, what does he want with your land? Timber rights. The pine on the North Ridge is old growth, the kind that sells for a premium in California. And you owe him $600. The previous owner's widow sold him the original deed. He says I owe back rent. 90 days to pay or he evicts under the terms he wrote into the lease, $600. She was doing arithmetic. He could tell because she went quiet in a particular way. And you have $2. I have $0. I spent them. If she found this funny, she kept it entirely to herself. What do you have, she said. The land, the cabin. 38 goats, a mule with opinions, the land you're about to lose. That's the situation, yes. She didn't say anything for a while. The foothills came up on the western horizon, pine dark and going purple in the failing light. Ruth watched them with the attention of someone reading a text in an unfamiliar language, cataloging. Noting the goats, she said. Wool and meat? Wool mostly. Some meat sales when I can spare them. What does 38 head of goats earn you in a good month? $20, maybe $25. So to make 690 days, you'd need to triple your best month. Consistently. For 3 months. I'm aware that the math is bad. The math isn't bad, Ruth said. The math is honest. The plan is bad. She turned to look at him for the first time since they'd left town. What was next to the barn? The brick structure. He hadn't expected that question. Old forge. Belonged to the man who homesteaded the place before me. Morrison. He died last winter. You use it? I don't know how. Does it work? I don't know. Hasn't been touched since I've been there. She turned back to the road, went quiet again. The ranch came into view as the last of the sunlight was leaving. The cabin crouched against the hillside in the apologetic way of a structure that knew it wasn't much and had made its peace with that. Gray logs weathered past silver into something closer to bone. One shutter hanging at the wrong angle. The roof patched in 3 places with wood that didn't match them. The barn leaned slightly south. The slow lean of a building that had been meaning to collapse for some years and kept changing its mind. The goat pen had gaps where fence posts had rotted and been replaced with whatever was available. And there, to the left of the barn, the forge. Brick walls gone dusty orange and white with age, the opening dark and cold, the old bellows hanging off its bracket like a shed skin, and the anvil visible from the wagon seat sitting in the dim interior of the structure, iron gray going rust at the base. Ruth off the wagon before Jude had fully stopped Birch. She walked to the forge with the direct, purposeful stride of someone who knew where they were going and wasn't interested in the scenic route. She ducked through the low doorway. He heard her moving inside them. He unhitched Birch, got the mule settled with water and the last of the oats, and then went to the forge doorway and looked in. Ruth was on one knee beside the anvil with her hand flat against its surface pressing. She stood and moved to the bellows and worked the lever twice. The rotted leather exhaled a cloud of old dust. She examined the brick lining of the firebox with 2 fingers, tracing the mortar lines. She picked up a hammer that had been hanging on the wall. Tested its weight. Set it down. Picked up another. Set that down too. The anvil is good, she said, not looking at him solid through. The bellows need completely new leather. The firebox needs repointing on the east side and 2 courses of new brick at the top. The chimney looks intact from below, but I'd want to run a clean fire before I was sure. She straightened. There's a mining camp at Silver Peak. 20 miles north, I know it.
Growing fast, that's what I hear.
A camp that size needs tools constantly. Picks, chisels, drill bits, horseshoes, nails, things that break and wear out and need replacing faster than the supply wagons can bring them. They'd pay good money for local production. No freight delay, no shipping cost. Half the price of catalog goods still means 3 times my margin. She looked at him. I need $40 for materials. New leather for the bellows. Fire brick, coal, iron stock. $40 and I can have this forge producing in a week. Jude looked at the cold forge. Looked at the number in his head, which was 0. I don't have $40, I know. I just told you I have $0. I heard you. So how? You've been here 8 years. Her voice was patient in the way of someone who'd already worked through the problem and was now explaining the solution to someone who was still finding the problem. You know people, ranchers, neighbors, people who've been watching Doss work this valley. You go to them, you explain what you're trying to do. You ask for small amounts. $10 from one person, $15 from another. You don't need anyone to give you $40. You need 4 people to give you 10. People don't lend money to strangers, they lend it to you. I'm the stranger. Something in her voice shifted, just barely. You spent $2 on me. You said it wasn't charity. So let me work. He looked at her, standing in the doorway of the dead forge with the last light going orange behind her. And he understood something that he hadn't been letting himself understand since the moment he'd said $2 in a room full of laughing men. He understood that she was right, and that the plan was better than anything he'd come up with in 3 years of watching the walls close in, and that the reason he wanted to argue with her had nothing to do with the plan at all. If they say no, he said, Then we find another way, no hesitation.
But we don't give up.
Jude Calloway had not said yes to anything in a very long time. All right, he said. Inside the cabin he made a fire and heated beans and salt pork. Simple. Enough. Ruth sat at the table and ate with the efficiency of someone who'd been burning through calories for days on train food and anxiety and hadn't had a real meal since Texas. She ate everything on her plate. She drank 2 cups of coffee. Some color came back into her face, not much but enough to suggest a person underneath the exhaustion. The bedroom is yours, Jude said. She looked up. This is your house. You're my wife. Legally. This is a business arrangement. We both know what it is. Do we? He wasn't arguing. He was genuinely asking. Ruth set her cup down. I came here to survive. You needed help with the ranch. We made a practical exchange. That's what it is. Is that what you think I want from you, isn't it? Jude moved to the fireplace and built the fire higher, giving himself something to do with his hands. I think, he said carefully, watching the flame take hold, that we both needed something we didn't know how to ask for. I think we were both at the end of something when today happened. He turned from the fire. I won't pretend I know what this is yet, but I know you're not a business arrangement, and I know I meant it when I said you didn't have to stay. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. He could see the calculation in it, the weighing. She'd learned to measure people the way you measure load-bearing walls, looking for the place where the structure would give. I'll take the bedroom, she said finally, because I'm going to collapse if I don't lie down in the next 5 minutes, and I'd rather not do it in front of you. Fair enough, she stood. At the bedroom door she stopped. Jude. He looked up. Thank you. For the $2? She closed the door. He stood alone in the firelight and listened to the small sounds of her settling, the boots hitting the floor, the long exhale of the mattress taking weight, the deep and almost immediate shift in her breathing that meant she was already asleep. The Montana night pressed against the windows, cold and enormous and full of weather that hadn't happened yet. Jude sat in the chair by the fire with his hands on his knees and thought about what it meant to have someone else breathing in his house. It was not a comfortable thought. Comfort wasn't really the point. Morning came gray and cold with frost on the inside of the window glass. Jude was up before light. Built the fire. Ground coffee beans he was now going to need to ration more carefully. And stood in the middle of his kitchen trying to remember the last time he'd made breakfast for 2 people. Ellen had been gone 3 years. Before that she'd cooked breakfast. Before that there had been a period. Maybe 6 months in the middle of their marriage. When they'd cooked together in this same small kitchen. Their movements interfering with each other's in the pleasant way of 2 people learning to share a small space. Before that there had been the war, and before the war there had been his mother's kitchen in Ohio, which was not this kitchen and was not this life. He was slicing salt pork when the bedroom door opened. Ruth came out already dressed, hair already pinned, wearing the same calico dress because it was the only one she had. Her face in the morning light was different from her face in lamplight, more tired and more alive at the same time. The hollow under her cheekbones more visible, the intelligence in her eyes more immediate. She stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen and then at him and said, I should be doing that. You just woke up. Cooking was part of the arrangement. There's no arrangement. The pork sizzled when it hit the pan. Sit down, Calloway. Jude. He didn't look at her. If we're married, we might as well use first names. She sat. There was a particular quality to the silence she made when she sat, a kind of contained alertness. She was watching him cook with the same attention she'd given the forge last night. Filing information. I need to start on the forge today, she said. I need to ride out to see Mateo Reyes first. He's the closest neighbor with means. Jude put a cup of coffee on the table in front of her. If anyone in this valley will lend money to beat Doss, it's Mateo. Ruth wrapped both hands around the cup, seemed to be drawing warmth from it in more ways than one. Who else? Ada Crow. She's 3 miles east, runs her own ranch since her husband died. She knows what Doss is. He paused. And Pete Garner, though Pete doesn't have much left. How much do you need from each? If I can get 10 from Mateo and 15 from Ada and 10 from Pete, that's 35. Close enough that I can cover the rest by selling the oldest buck. Don't sell the buck. I'll work with 35. She drank her coffee. What's Mateo like? 60-some years old. Been in Montana longer than most white men. He's seen every land grab and every scheme and every man who came here thinking he was smarter than the territory. Jude put food on the table and sat across from her. He doesn't lend money to people he doesn't trust, so he trusts you. He did before the ranch started failing. Failing isn't the same as untrustworthy. In Montana it can look the same from the outside. Ruth cut her food without ceremony. Tell him the plan. All of it. The forge, the mining camp, the timeline. Don't ask him to believe in you. Ask him to believe in the math. She ate for a moment. The math is good. I thought you said the math was honest. Honest math is good math. The corner of her mouth moved. Almost. Not quite. The plan is better than it was yesterday. Yesterday there was no plan. Jude ate. The fire crackled. Outside, Birch made the sound he made every morning when he wanted oats, a particular resonant complaint that carried. You rode all the way from Abilene, he said. I took the train to Billings. Rode the stage from there. Still. He watched her. Why Montana? She was quiet for a moment. The question had weight she was deciding how to distribute. Because Texas knew me, she said finally. Every street in Abilene had a different version of the same opinion about what I was. A woman that size. A woman who'd worked a smithy. A woman she stopped. Montana didn't know me. Montana was just cold and far away and putting notices in the papers for women who wanted a different life than the one they had. And this is the different life. She looked around the small cabin, at the patched walls and the low ceiling and the window with frost still melting at the corners. This is the beginning of one, she said. Whether it becomes different depends on the next 90 days. He rode out after breakfast. Mateo's ranch was 7 miles south on the flats, a proper operation compared to Jude's foothills holding proper fencing and a solid house and cattle that were well fed going into winter. Mateo met him in the yard with a look that said he'd heard about yesterday already, because word traveled in a valley this size the way water traveled, finding every low place. The $2 man, Mateo said. Not unkindly. Is that what they're calling me? That's what Pruitt's calling you. Pruitt tells everyone everything. It is his only quality. Mateo poured coffee from the pot that was always on his stove and set a cup in front of Jude, and sat across from him with the unhurried patience of a man who'd outlasted most things by giving them room to breathe. Tell me, Jude told him, all of it. The forge, the plan, the math. The mining camp at Silver Peak, the 90 days and the $600 and the particular shape of the trap Doss had built around him. Mateo listened without interruption. This was one of the things Jude respected about him. He listened the way a man listened when he intended to actually use what he heard. Your wife, Mateo said when Jude finished. She knows blacksmithing. Her father was a smith. She worked with him for years. She can actually produce. She told me what was wrong with the forge in 10 minutes without touching a tool. Knew the bellows, the firebox, the chimney. She knew it the way you know something you've been doing since you were grown. Mateo turned his coffee cup in a slow circle on the table. Doss is going to push back. He already pushed back. Cut off my coal supplier the same day, and it won't stop there. Mateo looked out his kitchen window toward the northern ridge, the same ridge Doss had looked at from horseback. That timber is worth a great deal of money to him. He's been patient about it, which means he's very sure of the outcome. He looked back at Jude. $20. Jude blinked. I can give you $20. Mateo said it simply, the way he said everything. You pay it back when you can. No interest, no timeline. He held up one finger. One condition. Name it, you win. Jude rode to Ada Crow's place next. Ada's ranch was smaller than Mateo's, harder won, kept going by sheer force of a woman who'd decided that Silas Drummond and weather and bad luck were not going to take what her husband had built. She was in her pasture when Jude arrived, checking fence with a method that involved her hands and her eyes in equal measure. She listened to the plan, leaning against the fence post with her arms crossed and her face doing nothing visible. When he finished, she said $15. Ada, my husband signed papers he didn't read. Doss wrote them. She uncrossed her arms. I'm not lending you $15. I'm paying $15 for someone to beat him. She walked back toward her barn. Tell your wife to keep good records. Everything she makes, everything she sells. Doss will look for a weakness in the paperwork if he can't find one anywhere else. Pete Garner was the last stop. Old Pete, who'd lost the east half of his property to Doss 2 years ago through a deed dispute that everyone in the valley knew was manufactured and nobody had been able to prove. Pete met him at the door of his cabin with the look of a man who'd been half expecting this visit. $10, Pete said before Jude had finished. It's everything I've got extra and I know it. Take it. He pressed a folded bill into Jude's hand. And tell that wife of yours to make something good with it. $45. More than he'd asked for. Jude rode home in the late afternoon light with $45 in his shirt pocket, and something he hadn't felt in long enough that he'd forgotten the word for it. Not hope exactly, something more cautious than hope. The possibility that hope was a reasonable thing to consider. Ruth was at the forge when he got back. She'd already begun. Somehow in the hours he'd been gone she'd cleared the interior, swept out years of debris, organized what tools remained into piles of keep and discard, and was now in the process of removing the damaged-facing bricks from the firebox one by one, stacking them outside to determine which could be reused. She was covered in brick dust, and she was working with the systematic efficiency of someone who'd shut off the part of their mind that wondered about things and activated the part that simply did. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment. $45, he said. She straightened. She was holding a broken brick in each hand. Mateo gave more than 10, 20. Something moved in her face. Good man, he said, to tell you to win, that's the plan. She turned back to the firebox. I'm going to need to ride to town tomorrow for materials. I can go alone. Don't need you for that. I'll come. You'll slow me down. I know what I need and I know what I'm paying for it. You don't know either. Not harsh. Just accurate. Stay here. Check the fence on the north end of the goat pen. The post by the juniper tree is rotted through and will lose animals if it goes in a windstorm. Jude opened his mouth, closed it. She was right. He'd been meaning to fix that fence post for 2 weeks. He fixed the fence post. That night she was back from town before dark with a borrowed wagon loaded with everything she'd said she needed. Coal heavy and black in burlap sacks, new leather, good thick stuff, fire brick, 2 dozen carefully wrapped iron stock, a bundle of it, various gauges. She'd spent $38.20, and she had a receipt for every item, precise as a bank ledger, written in the large, clear hand he'd seen on the marriage contract. She unloaded the wagon herself. Refused help with the coal sacks, which weighed 60 pounds each, carrying them the same way she carried everything, with the matter-of-fact physicality of someone who'd never learned to pretend the weight wasn't there. After supper in the firelight, she was quiet for a long time. Then Jude. He looked up from the harness he was mending. In town today, the man at the coal merchant. He asked who I was buying for. She looked at the fire. When I told him Calloway's ranch, he looked at me differently. Not the way men usually look at me. A pause. Like he was sorry for me, for a different reason than usual. Doss talks. I know. She turned her cup in her hands. He's going to make this harder than it needs to be. Every way he can think of. Yes, then we need to think of more ways than he can. The fire was the only sound for a moment. My father, Ruth said. Her voice had shifted register, quieter, more careful. He had a saying. He'd say that iron doesn't care whose hands are on the hammer. Iron cares about heat and force and time. That's all it requires. She looked at the fire. I've been thinking about that. About what it means when you apply it to other things. Jude set the harness down. What does it mean? It means that what we're building out there. She nodded toward the forge. Doesn't care that I'm a woman or that you're a man who's behind on his rent. It doesn't care that 60 men laughed at us yesterday. It only cares whether we show up and do the work. She stood. So that's what we do. She went to bed. He stayed by the fire. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north. The way it did when something significant was building in the mountains. Not a threat yet, just a suggestion. Just the territory reminding whoever was listening that it had opinions about what happened here and the means to express them. Jude Calloway sat in the chair by the fire and thought about $45 and 90 days and a woman who talked about iron the way other people talked about faith. And he thought that tomorrow morning, before anything else, he was going to stand outside that forge and listen to the first fire Ruth Cawley Calloway built on his land, because something was going to happen in that moment. He didn't have the word for it yet. He was starting to think he might need to find one. The forge came alive on the 4th day. Not dramatically. Not the way things came alive in stories with some grand moment of revelation and light. It came alive the way real things did. Slowly, with effort. With Ruth on her knees in the dirt repointing the last of the firebox mortar at 6 in the morning while frost was still hard on the ground and Jude was inside making coffee he hadn't been asked to make but made anyway because it was something he could do. She'd spent 3 days on the rebuild. The bellows first. The old leather stripped off and the new leather cut and fitted and laced with the precision of someone who understood that the bellows was the lung of the whole operation, and a lung that didn't seal was the same as no lung at all. Then the firebox, each damaged brick replaced or repositioned. The mortar mixed to the right consistency by feel. By touch. By some internal calibration that had nothing to do with measuring cups, and everything to do with years of her hands knowing what right felt like. Then the chimney, which turned out to be sound where it counted, which Ruth announced by saying nothing and simply moving on to the next task. She worked in her calico dress with a leather apron tied over it, the apron borrowed from the barn where Morrison had left his tools hanging on their pegs like artifacts from a life interrupted mid-sentence. The apron was too short for her and too wide at the shoulders, but it covered what it needed to cover. Her hair stayed pinned. Her hands got black with coal dust and stayed that way. On the morning of day 4, she called to him from the forge doorway. He came out with his coffee. She was standing at the bellows with her hand on the lever and the coal already laid in the firebox, and the expression on her face of someone about to find out if a year of planning worked or didn't. She pumped the bellows. Once, twice the coal caught, Jude watched the color change, red and then redder and then orange, climbing toward the lip of the firebox, heat rising in waves that bent the air above the forge opening. Ruth worked the bellows in a steady rhythm, not fast, not slow. The rhythm of someone who knew that patience was part of the technique. She watched the fire with total attention. The rest of the world, the cabin behind them, the goat pen, the frost-killed grass of the yard. All of it ceased to exist for her in that moment. There was the fire and there was the iron stock she was reaching for with the tongs, and there was the particular quality of the heat she was waiting for. She placed the iron in the coals, waited. Jude stayed where he was, didn't speak. He understood from watching her these 3 days that talking while she worked was like talking in a church. Not prohibited, just wrong in some way that didn't need explaining. When the iron came out of the fire, it was the color of a harvest moon, orange-red and glowing its own internal light. She moved it to the anvil in one continuous motion, and the hammer came up and came down. The sound that came out of that first strike rang across the yard and up the hillside and into the trees and off the rock face above the tree line and came back changed, bigger, like the valley itself had been waiting for something to echo and had decided this was worth the effort. And again, the rhythm of it even and deliberate and absolutely certain of itself. 20 minutes later, she held up a horseshoe. She turned it in the light, examined the curve, the nail holes, the thickness at the heel, put it down on the work shelf Morrison had built along the south wall. She turned and looked at Jude. He'd finished his coffee somewhere around the third hammer strike and hadn't noticed. "I've seen things built in this territory," he said. "Never seen anything built like that." Ruth wiped her hands on the apron. "It's a horseshoe. It's proof." She looked at the horseshoe, back at him. And then something happened in her face that was small and quick and probably involuntary. Not a full smile. The beginning of one, maybe. The muscles moving before the decision was made. And then the decision to stop them was made, and she turned back to the forge. "I need you on the bellows this afternoon, and we need more iron stock than I bought." I underestimated the nail order. He learned the bellows. It was not complicated and it was not easy, and the complexity of it was the part where simple mechanics met physical endurance. Which was the rhythm Ruth needed from him, steady and consistent over hours, not strong and fast for 10 minutes. He learned that lesson on the first afternoon when he pushed hard and fast, because that's what work had always meant to him. And Ruth stopped what she was doing and said slower. "Even. Think of it like breathing. You don't breathe in bursts." He slowed down. He found the rhythm. His shoulders stopped complaining after the third day. They fell into a pattern without discussing it. Mornings she worked alone until the forge was hot enough to need help. He did the goats, checked fences, hauled water. After the noon meal they worked together until the light was gone. Evenings they ate, and then sat in the cabin in the kind of silence that was filling up with more content every day. Less absence and more the presence of two people who had enough in common now to not need constant words to prove it. He told her about Gettysburg on the 8th evening. Not because she asked. Because the fire was doing something with the light that made the cabin look like certain fields looked at certain hours, and his mouth opened before he'd decided to let it. He'd been 23 and certain of things that 23-year-olds were certain of them, which was mostly that bad things happened to other people, and that courage was a simple equation, and that he knew the difference between right and wrong, and that knowing was the same as being protected by it. He'd been wrong about all of those things by 10 in the morning of the third day at Cemetery Ridge, and by afternoon of that same day, he'd been wrong about most of what he thought a human being was capable of, and by the time it was over, he'd been wrong about everything. You came back from that kind of wrongness a different shape than you left. Some parts compressed that used to be open, some openings sealed that used to breathe. Ellen had married the man who came home, not the man who left. She'd done her best with what she had, which was the wrong husband and a good heart and the increasingly clear understanding that Montana winters were long and the ranch was failing, and her best wasn't going to be enough to fix what was broken in him. He didn't blame her for going. He'd said so to Ruth the first night, and he meant it more now than he had then. "She pitied you," Ruth said. "The fire popped. Not you specifically, the situation. And you couldn't separate the two." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "'Cause I've been pitied." She held her coffee cup in both hands the way she always did, drawing warmth. "It feels like being looked at through glass. Like the person is seeing something behind you instead of you." A pause. "I'd rather be laughed at. At least that requires they actually look." He thought about that for a long time. She told him about Abilene in pieces over the following evenings, not as a confession, more as information she was deciding he'd earned. Her father had run a smithy on the south end of town. The kind of establishment that kept a working town working, doing everything from wagon wheel repairs to surgical tools for the doctor, A man who understood that iron was the skeleton the rest of civilization was built on. She'd started at the forge when she was grown and capable of the work, her father's verdict being that the trade didn't care about the hand holding the hammer as long as the hand knew what it was doing. What the trade didn't care about and what Abilene cared about were different things. She'd had one offer of courtship. One. A dry goods clerk named Aldous who'd come to the smithy to order barrel hoops and stayed to talk and returned 3 more times before her father told him gently that Ruth wasn't interested, which Ruth corrected later. Privately to them. Ruth had been interested, but Aldous had asked her father's permission and not hers, and had referred to her twice in the same conversation as a fine big girl, which had answered all her questions about what Aldous was actually interested in. The smithy work. The size of her. Not the person who came with both. She came to Montana because the alternative was staying in Abilene and becoming the permanent answer to the question of what happened to women who didn't fit the available molds. She wasn't willing to become an answer to that question. She had too much work left to do. Jude listened to all of it without interrupting, which was apparently not what she was accustomed to. On the 3rd evening she stopped mid-sentence and said, "You're not going to say anything. I'm listening. Most people talk when I talk. To fill the space, or to explain my life back to me. I know what happened to you," he said. "I want to know what you think about what happened to you. That's different." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite wariness but was related to it. Something adjusting its position. "That," she said, "is a strange thing for a man to say. I'm a strange man," which was not particularly funny, and she laughed anyway. Short and surprised and genuine, the laugh of someone who didn't expect to. He tucked that sound away somewhere important. The jar on the kitchen shelf held $100 by the end of the 2nd week. Not enough. Not close enough. But moving. And then day 28 arrived, and with it the particular sound of hoofbeats that Jude had started to identify as trouble before his brain caught up to his ears. He was in the yard when the coal merchant's boy rode up with a note. He read it twice. He walked to the forge doorway. Ruth was mid-strike and he waited for her to finish the piece she was on before he said anything, because interrupting her mid-strike was something he'd learned not to do. She looked up, read his face. "What, Crawford's coal? They won't sell to us anymore." She set the hammer down on the anvil shelf. Set it down with care, which was how he knew she was angry. When she was merely frustrated, she put things down normally. When she was genuinely angry, she handled them like they were breakable, direct. The note says changes in business arrangements. But Crawford wouldn't make that call alone. Doss has to be. The silence that followed was the working kind. Ruth turned to look at the coal remaining in the bin. 2 days' worth at current production levels, maybe 3 if she adjusted the projects to lower heat work. The next supplier, she said, Red Fork, 20 miles. Price? I don't know yet. Find out today. She untied the apron. And find out if there's anyone between here and Red Fork who's storing coal for the winter that might sell us a portion. Smaller transactions, less visible. She picked up the hammer again. Doss can't control every coal pile in Montana territory. He can only control the ones he's thought of. Jude was back by evening with news that was good and bad in equal measure. Red Fork had coal. Red Fork would sell it. Red Fork charged double what Crawford had charged them, which cut the profit margin on every item Ruth produced in half, which meant the jar would fill more slowly, which meant the timeline got tighter without any days being removed from it. He told her at supper. She did the arithmetic in her head while she ate. He could tell because she got the focused look she got when she was working a problem, a slight narrowing around the eyes, a particular stillness of the jaw. "We make less on each piece," she said. "So we make more pieces. You're already working until dark." "I know my limits." She said it without defensiveness. Factual, I haven't hit them yet. She pushed back from the table. "I need to be at Red Fork by sunup. I'll take Birch in the pack frame. That's 20 miles, which is why I need to leave at midnight." She left at midnight. She was back by mid-afternoon the next day with 140 pounds of coal distributed across Birch's pack frame and the old canvas saddlebags. Birch expressing his opinion of the arrangement through the entire 20-mile return. She unloaded it, gave Birch his oats and a longer rest than usual, and was back at the forge by 3 in the afternoon. Jude watched her work that evening with something he couldn't quite name and had stopped trying to. She moved around the forge with the complete authority of a person in their correct element. Not performing competence, actually competent, which was a different thing entirely, and rarer. The hammer in her hand was an extension of intention, rather than a separate object to be managed. The fire responded to her attention the way animals responded to certain people. Not through any mystical quality, but through the simple fact of being read correctly and responded to accordingly. She caught him watching and raised one eyebrow. He looked away first. He was doing that more often. Looking first and then looking away, which was the opposite of his usual habit of looking at nothing and keeping it that way. $150 in the jar by day 30. Not enough. $50 a week was the pace they needed, and they were doing 35 on the best weeks and less on the weeks when the coal situation complicated production. The math was honest, but it was becoming less friendly. And then Holt Briggs rode in at dusk on day 31 and changed the shape of everything. Jude had seen Holt around the valley, a lean man who worked odd jobs for various operations and whose name came up in conversation in the particular way. Names came up when people were trying to say something they weren't quite saying. He came into the yard on a gray horse that was blowing hard from a fast ride, and he came with the look of a man who'd been carrying something heavy and had decided to put it down. Ruth came out of the forge when she heard the horse. She stood in the doorway, still in her apron, watching. Jude met Holt in the yard. Briggs. Holt dismounted and didn't bother with the pleasantries. Doss knows the exact number in your jar, how much you've made each week, what you're producing and where you're selling it. His voice was low and stripped of anything but information. He's been getting reports. The cold that went through Jude's chest wasn't from the October air. From who? Holt looked at the ground. Me. He raised his eyes back up. I've been watching this place and reporting to Doss for 6 weeks. He told me he'd get medicine for Maggie. Holt's jaw worked. He gave me colored water. Maggie is worse. Something moved in the yard that wasn't wind. Some shift in the available air. He lied to me, Holt said. About the medicine. About what he was going to do with the information. I thought he was just going to wait you out. I didn't know he was going to cut your coal and send fake buyers and... He stopped. I'm done with him. I just needed you to know. Jude studied him. Holt Briggs was not a man who'd arrived at this decision easily. The getting here had cost him something visible. What does he have planned next? Something bigger. He didn't say what, but he stopped being patient. You've lasted longer than he expected, and it's making him consider things he wouldn't have considered before. From the forge doorway, Ruth said, your wife. What's she sick with? Holt looked at her. Lung fever. 3 months now. Ruth untied her apron. Ada Crow is 3 miles east of here. You go to her tonight. You tell her I sent you, and you tell her about Maggie, and you let her decide what she can do. She held the apron out to Jude, who took it without knowing why. Ada knows remedies that Crawford's pharmacy doesn't stock because Crawford's pharmacy orders from catalogs, and Ada's knowledge doesn't come from catalogs. Holt looked between them. The decision on his face was not simple, but it arrived. I'll go, he remounted. Then he stopped, reins in hand, and looked at Jude directly. I'm sorry for the watching. I'd undo it if I could. Can't undo it, Jude said. But you can help us now if you're willing. Tell me what you need, know when you know. And come back. Holt rode east. Ada would either help or she wouldn't. Nothing to do but wait and work. The jar hit $175 the following week, and then $200 and then $225. Each increment a small victory that existed in exact tension with the calculation of what remained. 65 days left, $375 to make. The pace was not impossible. It was also not comfortable. Ada arrived on day 38 with the specific expression of a woman who'd made up her mind about something and intended to see it through. She looked at the forge first. She walked around it twice, and then she looked at the jar on the kitchen shelf when Jude showed her in, and she said, I want to come to the raising. The what? Jude said. Tell him, Ada said to Ruth. Ruth was already at the table with a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal. We take the forge down to the foundation and we rebuild it. Proper, not in a week with 2 people. In a day with 50. She looked up. We put the word out across the valley. Everyone who's had dealings with Doss, everyone who's watched him work this territory, everyone who wants to be part of the answer instead of part of the problem. They come with materials and labor. We build a real smithy, permanent stone foundation, proper chimney, sealed roof. Not something we're fixing as we go, something that says we plan to be here. Jude looked at the current forge, which had served them well and had its limits written into every patched brick of it. And Doss? Doss sees a building going up on this land that 40 or 50 people put their hands on, Ruth said. He has to decide whether he wants to fight all of them or just us. Those are different calculations. Ada nodded. I'll send word to the East Valley. Mateo will send word south. Pete Garner knows people along the river. How many would actually come? Jude said. More than Doss expects, Ada said. He spent years making people afraid and isolated. Fear and isolation only work until someone shows people they're not alone. She looked at Ruth. You've been showing them. Ruth shook her head. We've been showing them. That's different. Jude sent word with Ada and let Mateo handle the rest because Mateo had been in this valley long enough to know which doors to knock on and which to skip. He didn't know how many would come. He told himself he wasn't counting on many. He'd learned some things about hoping for crowds. 53 people came. They came on a Saturday when the sky was the particular cold blue of Montana October at its most honest. No clouds. No apology. Just light and cold and the mountains sitting where they always sat. They came with wagon beds full of field stone and sacks of mortar and tools and food, and some came with only their hands and their time and their presence, which was its own kind of material. Ruth directed everything. Not from any position of authority anyone had formally granted her. From knowledge. She knew what went where and why and in what order, and she communicated this to groups of people she'd met 15 minutes ago with a clarity that turned strangers into a workforce. By noon, the old forge was down to the foundation stones. By mid-afternoon, the walls were going up, stone by stone, mortared and leveled with a care that the original construction had never received. Holt Briggs worked harder than anyone. He'd come back 2 days after his first visit, quieter and more resolved, and had attached himself to the effort with the ferocity of a man paying a debt he'd already acknowledged couldn't be fully paid. He hauled stone. He mixed mortar. He learned from Ruth's direction without complaint and without the particular male pride that sometimes made men unable to follow direction from a woman. Maggie was better. Ada had come with powdered herbs and a knowledge of lung fever that the colored water from Doss had been designed to replace and hadn't. Maggie was going to live. Holt knew it was because of these people, and he intended to spend a long time making sure they knew he knew it. Pete Garner was there with his aching knees and his $10 bills worth of investment and his stories about the old days that he told to anyone within earshot while he handed stones up the chain. He'd lost half his land to Doss, and he hadn't stopped being Pete Garner, which said something about Pete Garner that was worth saying. Mateo played his guitar in the evening when the building was done and the food was out, and the work had become a celebration without anyone announcing the transition. The guitar was old, and Mateo's fingers knew it, the way hands knew tools they'd used for decades, finding the notes without looking for them, the music something between a hymn and a dance depending on which moment of it you were hearing. Ruth was standing at the edge of the firelight when Jude came to stand beside her. The new forge sat behind them in the dark, solid and permanent, its stone walls still warm from the day's work. She was looking at it. They built it, she said. Quiet, not quite disbelief. Something closer to gratitude encountering an obstacle. You gave them a reason to, we gave them a reason. She turned to look at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Something open and temporarily unguarded. I keep wanting to say it was just me. Old habit. Mateo was playing something slower now, something that had a waltz in its bones even if it wasn't quite a waltz. Someone called Jude's name from across the yard and then called it again and added something about a song, and someone else laughed, and the general drift of the assembled 53 people was, apparently, that Jude Calloway and his wife should dance. He looked at Ruth. She looked at him with the evaluating expression she used when she encountered an unanticipated situation. I don't, he started. Neither do I, she said. It'll look, probably. He held out his hand anyway. Because the alternative was declining in front of 53 people who'd just spent the day building them a forge, and that particular alternative seemed worse than whatever happened next. She took his hand. She was 6'2" of Blacksmith, and he was a mountain man who'd forgotten most of what passed for social graces in the years he'd spent talking mainly to a mule, and between them they produced something that was not quite dancing but was a genuine attempt at it. A slow rotation in the firelight with Mateo's guitar making the best of the situation. She was warm. He hadn't expected that. Warm in the particular way of a person who'd been working hard all day, heat still in the skin of her hand where she held his, in her shoulder where his other hand had landed. She smelled like wood smoke and iron and the cold outdoor air. You're not as bad as you said, she told him. I was counting on low expectations. Her grip on his hand tightened slightly, not a signal, just adjustment. But he was aware of it the way you were aware of small things that happened during close contact with a person you'd been pretending not to think about them. Someone called his name again, and the moment broke, and they separated with the naturalness of two people who'd silently agreed to pretend it hadn't meant anything, while also silently agreeing it had meant something, which was the kind of agreement that didn't need words and probably wouldn't survive being given them. On day 51, a man rode in whose boots were too clean. Warren Cole, that was the name he gave, buyer for the mining operations. He'd heard about the forge. He wanted to make a deal. He had a contract in a leather folder, and he set it on the table in Jude's kitchen. with the practiced ease of a man who put contracts on tables for a living and knew what that ease communicated. 200 items per month, $4 per item, $800 per month guaranteed purchase. First payment on delivery of 50 items within 2 weeks. Jude stared at the numbers. $800 a month was more than he'd made in the previous 3 years combined. $800 a month was not a solution to the problem. It was the end of the problem. Give us a day, Ruth said. Cole nodded pleasantly and left his contract and went to take a room at the boarding house in Clearwater Bend. Jude sat at the table with the contract in front of him and felt something that wasn't quite happiness but was shaped like relief, which was close enough that he was willing to accept it. Ruth sat across from him and put her hand flat on the contract cover without opening it. Read it first, she said. I was going to. You were going to say yes first and read it second. He picked it up and opened it. She reached across and turned it so they were both reading the same page. They read. Jude read the way he read most contracts, looking for the main terms and assuming the details were supportive. Ruth read differently. She read every line at the same speed as every other line, giving the small print the same attention as the headline numbers. She turned to section 7. She read subsection C twice. He watched her jaw set. Here, she said, and read it aloud. If the seller failed to deliver the agreed quantity in any given month, the buyer reserved the right to claim materials and equipment as compensation for breach. Equipment was not defined further. Materials was not defined further. The forge, Jude said. The forge, the tools, the iron stock. If the word equipment means what it can mean, it could reach as far as the building itself. She closed the contract. And the building is on the land. The silence that followed had the quality of something being carefully disassembled. He's getting clever, Jude said. He's been clever. He's just running low on indirect approaches. Ruth pushed the contract to the center of the table. We miss one delivery. For any reason. Whether or illness or a supply problem. And whoever signed this can walk in here and take everything. We could negotiate the clause out. Cole won't accept that. The clause is the reason he's here. She looked at the contract. $800, she said. And the way she said it was the way you named something you'd decided to refuse. Not with anger, with clarity. It's not $800. It's a mechanism. The next morning, Jude met Cole at the boarding house and returned the contract unsigned and told him the terms weren't workable. Cole's pleasant expression didn't change, which was how you knew it wasn't an expression at all but a technique. He said that was unfortunate. He said the offer would expire. He said he hoped Calloway would reconsider. Jude said he didn't think he would. Cole folded the contract and put it in his leather folder, with the care of a man filing something for later use, not throwing it away. He said good day. He walked out. At the end of the boardwalk, he stopped and looked back at Jude with the brief, specific look of a man confirming a location on a map. Jude rode home. Ruth was at the forge, he told her. She kept working while he talked, which was not dismissiveness but the particular ability of someone who could process information and shape iron simultaneously. He'll tell Doss we refused, she said between strikes. Yes, Doss will move to something else now. Something more direct. That's what I think. She set a finished hinge on the shelf and picked up fresh stock. How much time do we have before something happens? He thought about Cole's look on the boardwalk. Not much. She nodded and went back to work, and he stood in the forge doorway watching her and thought about $800 in the cage it would have been and felt, in the place where relief had been an hour ago, something different. Something that involved the word we and how easily it had started to come. It was day 58 when he found her sitting on the low wall outside the forge in the middle of the afternoon. Not working, just sitting, hands loose in her lap, looking at nothing. He'd never seen her sit in daylight hours. Not once, not in 2 months. He sat beside her. Didn't say anything, she said. Yesterday I left the iron in too long. It got past the working temperature and went brittle. Broke on the anvil when I struck it. She said it the way you'd report a fact about someone else. I haven't done that since I first learned the trade. You need to rest. We're at $225. We need 375 more in 32 days. And you need to rest. Those two things don't solve each other. One of them solves both of them. He turned to look at her. She was staring at the middle distance with the look of a person doing sums that weren't adding up. Ruth, if you burn out before the deadline, we lose regardless. Rested, you're the most capable person on this ranch. Exhausted, you leave iron in the fire too long. He paused. Take today. Actually take it. Tomorrow you come back stronger. You can't tell me I'm not telling you. I'm asking. A beat. As your partner, she looked at him. The word had done something. Partner, she said, testing it. That's what you are, since about day 2. She was quiet for a moment. Then she stood and took off her apron and folded it over the wall and walked toward the cabin without another word. He sat on the low wall and listened to the forge cooling down and thought about 32 days and $375 and the sound of iron breaking when the heat has been applied too long in the wrong conditions. That night Matteo came by. They sat outside near the small fire Jude had made for warmth, and Matteo said what he'd been building to since he arrived. "You love her." Jude fed a piece of wood into the fire. "She's my partner." That's what I said. He didn't argue because arguing would have required a position he wasn't sure he could defend. "Them. My wife before she died." "Them." Matteo said. "Them. She told me that love isn't the easy seasons. Anyone can love someone when the weather cooperates. Love is who stays when the weather doesn't." He looked at Jude across the fire. "In 32 days, whatever happens, you need to tell her. Not because the outcome is certain, because she deserves to know." Jude watched the fire. Through the cabin wall he could hear Ruth breathing in a deep even sleep that she'd been overdue for by weeks. "What if she doesn't?" he started. "She does," Matteo said. "I have eyes, tell her." Before she went to bed, Ruth had stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. She'd said, "I didn't come here to just survive, Jude." Them. And then she'd closed the door and he'd sat in the firelight with those 7 words and turned them over like a piece of iron that needed more heat to show its true shape. He was still turning them when dawn came in gray over the mountain tops. And then he heard the sound from outside, the wrong kind of sound, heavy and structural and final. He was out the door before he was fully awake. The east wall came down at dawn on day 60. Not a collapse that announced itself, not the kind of structural failure that gave warning. Them. Just the particular silence of a Montana morning breaking open into a sound that had no business being there, heavy and final and wrong in the way that certain sounds were wrong before the mind caught up to what they meant. Jude was already moving before he understood why, out the cabin door with one boot on and the cold hitting his face like a flat hand. The northeast corner had gone first. Them. The foundation stone there, the one set half an inch off level during the barn raising because they'd been working fast and full of hope and not measuring carefully enough, had shifted through 6 weeks of frost heave and hammer vibration until it had nothing left to give. The wall followed the stone, the chimney followed the wall, the roof section followed the chimney and came down across the work shelf and the quench tank and the new bellows and $30 worth of finished product that had been sitting there waiting for delivery. He stood in the yard and looked at it. 30 days left until the deadline. $225 in the jar. $375 still needed. No forge. Ruth came out behind him. Them. She'd heard it from the bedroom and she'd dressed and pinned her hair in the time it took him to cross the yard, which told him something about how she'd been sleeping. She stood beside him and looked at what was left, and she did the same arithmetic he was doing and arrived at the same answer. "We don't have time to rebuild it," she said. "Not despair. Diagnosis, we rebuilt it once in a day. With 50 people and 2 weeks' notice, we have 30 days and no margin." Them. She turned and went back inside, and he followed her, and she sat at the table and put her hands flat on the wood the way she did when she was working through something she didn't want to be working through. "Even if everyone came again tomorrow, we lose 3 days of production. 3 days we don't have." He looked at the jar on the shelf. $225. It had seemed like movement yesterday. This morning it was just a number on the wrong side of 600. Matteo came through the door without knocking, because Matteo had stopped knocking 3 weeks ago, and he went outside and looked at the forge for 30 seconds, and came back in and put $15 on the table without saying anything about it first. Ada Crow arrived an hour later with $12, and the expression of a woman who had also done the arithmetic and chosen not to discuss it. Them. Pete Garner came mid-morning with 10 folded in his vest, and the look of a man spending his last reserves on something he believed in more than he believed in his own comfort. $47 from people who had nothing extra. Jude looked at it on the table beside his 225 and felt the gap between that total and 600 as a physical thing, like a distance he was being asked to cross with no ground under it. "We can't take this," he said. Matteo looked at him with the patience of a man who had outlasted many arguments by simply not engaging with them. "It's already on the table." Ruth had been quiet through all of it. Now she looked up. She looked at Matteo and Ada and Pete, and then she looked at Jude with the focused expression she wore when she'd finished calculating and had reached a conclusion she didn't like but intended to act on anyway. "The goats," she said. He knew what she meant before she said anything else. He knew it the way you knew weather in a place you'd lived long enough to read, not from the sky but from some older sensing. "Ruth, them. If we sell them all now, them. Emergency sale at Silver Peak. Whatever the market gives us, them. We might close the gap, them." She kept her voice even because she understood what she was asking and she wasn't going to pretend she didn't. If we don't have the land, we have nowhere to run goats anyway. And if we try and it's still not enough, at least we lost on our own terms. Not because we held back 8 years. He knew the goats the way you knew anything you'd spent years in close and daily company with, imperfectly and completely at once. Old Bess, who'd been the first animal he bought when he came to Montana, and who communicated her views on every subject through a precise system of sounds he'd never meant to learn to read but had. Buck, the lead male, ornery about everything and reliable about what mattered. 38 animals that had kept him alive, and solvent through seasons that had tried to do otherwise. He looked at Ruth's hands flat on the table, waiting. "All right," he said. "We sell the goats." Something moved in her face that wasn't relief. Relief was smaller than what moved across her face. It was the expression of a person who'd asked someone to pay a real price, and was sitting with the full weight of having asked it. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her hand was larger than his. Neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them moved, and the fire in the hearth made its small sounds, and outside the wind came off the mountain with the patience of something that had been waiting there longer than any of them. Before he left, she stopped him at the door. She'd come to stand in the kitchen doorway, and she looked at him in the gray before light with her hair already pinned and her apron already tied, and the expression of a woman who had something to say and had decided to say it before the opportunity narrowed. "Whatever happens when you get back." She stopped, started again. "I didn't come to Montana just to survive. I want you to know that before you go." He held that sentence in the cold air between them. It was not a small sentence. It had the density of something that had been considered for a long time before being released. "I'll be back," he said. "And we'll talk about it properly then." The drive to Silver Peak took 2 days pushing hard. Jude and Mateo, moving 38 goats through the foothills, passed with the wordless coordination of men who'd both spent decades working with animals that had their own opinions about cooperation. The goats had opinions about every creek crossing and every shadow and every unfamiliar rock formation that might, if you were a goat with unlimited anxiety, be something that wanted to eat you. At night they camped in a narrow draw with the animals bunched together for warmth, and Jude sat with his back against a boulder and looked at the fire, and thought about Ruth's hand on his and the sentence she'd said at the door. Old Bess came and stood close to his leg at some point in the middle of the night in the way she'd done for 8 years when she'd decided his proximity was preferable to the alternatives. He put his hand on her side and felt her breathing, and didn't examine what he was feeling because the words for it weren't ready yet. The livestock buyer at Silver Peak was a man named Garrett, direct and unhurried in the manner of someone who conducted many transactions and had long since stripped them of pleasantry. He looked at the herd with the assessment of a man running a private calculation. He offered $40. Jude's jaw tightened. They're worth 3 times that in a normal market. This isn't a normal market. Had 3 other sellers through this week. Garrett wasn't apologizing, he was reporting. 40 for the lot. Come back in a month if you want a better price. Jude didn't have a month. He looked at Mateo. Mateo's face said what there was to say. $40, Jude said. He watched them go, the whole herd. Bess with her particular stride, head raised, cataloging the new territory. Buck moving with the offended dignity he brought to every unfamiliar situation. 38 animals that had been the material evidence of 8 years of effort, walking away behind a stranger, and all he had to show for them was 2 $20 bills that brought his total to $312. Short by 288. They rode back in 3 days, pushing the horses harder than was comfortable, arriving at the ranch before sunup on day 65. Ruth came out when she heard the horses. She was dressed, and her hair was pinned, and her face had the look of someone who'd been awake long enough that the distinction between night and morning had become administrative. She looked at him. "How much?" "40 for all of them." "So we have 312. We need 600. We're short 288. The number sat in the yard between them in the cold morning air. $288 with 26 days left and no forge and no goats and no other asset that could be converted to cash before the deadline. Ada was inside them. She and Ruth had spent 3 days at the table going over the same numbers from every angle and arriving at the same answer each time, which was the answer nobody wanted. Jude sat down. Ruth stood at the window looking at the collapsed east wall of the forge in the early gray light, which she had apparently been doing at intervals for 3 days, and which the wall was not going to resolve no matter how long she looked at it. Holt Briggs came by that afternoon, quieter than he'd been in weeks, and sat at the table and said nothing for a while. Then he said Maggie was better. Really better, the kind of better that meant she was going to stay better. He said it to Ruth specifically, which was right, Because Ruth had sent him to Ada, and Ada's knowledge was the reason Maggie was sitting up and eating and talking about spring. Holt said he owed them something that couldn't be repaid in the normal way, and he intended to spend a long time making sure they understood he knew that. Then he said, "Doss is coming on the 90th day, noon. I heard it from the man who supplies his household. He's bringing his land agent and a document already prepared for transfer of title. He's not expecting problems. He's not going to get the money," Ruth said. She said it without bitterness. Factual. No. Holt looked at the table. "But he's going to get an audience. Word's been spreading about what you've been doing here. People want to see how it ends." After Holt left, the cabin was quiet in the particular way of people sitting with a situation that had been fully examined and had no remaining angles. The fire, the jar with $312, the window with the collapsed forge beyond it. Ruth turned from the window. "Send word to everyone. Mateo, Ada, Pete, Holt, anyone who came to the barn raising, anyone who lent money, anyone who's been watching this." She looked at Jude directly. "Ask them to come on the 90th day, not to fight, just to be here, just to stand on this land, even if we lose, especially if we lose." Something in her voice had the quality of iron at working temperature, past the point of uncertainty, committed to the shape it was moving toward. If Doss is going to take this place, he's going to do it in front of everyone who built that forge. He's going to have to look at all of them while he does it. Jude sent word. He didn't know how many would come. He'd learned something about not counting on crowds. In the 26 days remaining, they did what they could with what they had. The collapsed forge couldn't be rebuilt in time, but certain tasks didn't require it. Jude repaired the fence line that had been deferred since October. He winterized the water trough and re-chinked the cabin's north wall against the coming cold. Ruth sorted and inventoried every piece of finished product that had survived the collapse, cleaned and organized the tools, drafted detailed plans for the forge rebuild on paper, calculating the exact materials needed and the correct sequence of construction so that when the time came, if the time came, they could begin without delay. She worked at the table in the evenings by lamplight, drawing in the large, precise hand she used for everything that mattered. He brought coffee and she drank it without looking up, and he sat across from her and watched her work and stopped pretending to himself that he was doing anything other than watching her. On the 23rd evening, he said her name and she looked up. He'd had the words ready for 3 days and had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept being the current moment, and he kept finding reasons why it was actually the next one. He understood finally that there was no next one available, and that what he was really doing was being afraid, which was a thing he'd stopped admitting to himself around the time he came home from the war. "I love you," he said. Not decorated, not hedged. The same register he'd used when he said $2 across a room full of laughing men, not performing the thing but simply doing it because the alternative had stopped being acceptable. Ruth set her pencil down on the paper. She was quiet for long enough that he understood she wasn't forming the answer. She was deciding whether to let herself give it. "I told myself for about 2 weeks that this was a business arrangement," she said. "That I came here to survive, and that was the whole of it." She looked at him across the lamplight with the directness she brought to everything that required accuracy. "After that I was just lying to myself because it was easier than the alternative." He waited. "I love you, Jude. I've been carrying it around for a month trying to figure out what the right time was to say it." A pause. "Turns out there isn't a right time. There's just the time when you stop waiting for one." He reached across the table and took her hand. Her hand was larger than his. He had not once in 67 days of knowing her cared about that. They sat in the lamplight with the plans for the forge rebuild between them and the jar with $312 on the shelf, and 23 days left and nothing resolved except the one thing that had been unresolved longest, and that turned out to be sufficient for the evening. The 90th day arrived cold and clear, the sky the hard blue of Montana in November when the weather was holding its breath between storms. Jude was up before light. He built the fire and made coffee and went outside and stood in the yard looking at the collapsed forge in the dark. He heard horses before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Then more horses, then a wagon, then another. Mateo came first, which was not a surprise. Riding the road from the south with his guitar slung across his back, because Mateo brought the guitar the way other men brought their rifles, as the tool most likely to be needed. Ada Crow came from the east with her 2 sons. Pete Garner came from the river road, breathing harder than the ride warranted, the exertion of a man who'd decided this was worth whatever it cost his knees. Holt and Maggie Briggs came together. Maggie straight-backed on her horse, her color better than it had been in months. Something restored in her face that had been missing when Ada first went to see her. They kept coming. Families from the barn raising. Ranchers from the South Valley who'd heard the story in pieces over weeks. A woman from Clearwater Bend who'd bought horseshoes from Ruth and wanted to see where they came from. The man who ran the feed store, who had watched Doss operate in this county for a decade and had his own feelings about the outcome. 41 people in the yard of a failing ranch on a November morning with nothing to offer except their presence, which turned out to be the thing that was needed. Ruth stood on the porch and watched them arrive. She was wearing her work dress and her apron because she'd been working until 30 minutes ago, finishing the last of the forge plans. And she hadn't changed because she was Ruth. And changing clothes for an occasion was the kind of thing that belonged to a different version of herself than the one she'd become. Her hair was pinned. Her hands were clean, which was as far as she went with ceremony. She looked at Jude, he looked at her. "Whatever happens," she said. "Whatever happens," he agreed. Harlan Doss rode in at noon with his land agent, a thin man named Pruitt who carried a leather case and wore the expression of a man who processed paperwork and had no opinions about its contents. Doss had 2 other men with him, not armed, not threatening, the escort of a man who expected no resistance because he'd done the arithmetic and the arithmetic was on his side. He looked at the 41 people in the yard with the first genuine surprise Jude had seen on his face in 3 months. He recovered quickly. Doss always recovered quickly. "Calloway," the pleasant voice, completely intact. "I see you've gathered an audience for the proceedings." "They wanted to be here," Jude said. Doss looked at the crowd. At Mateo, who had not dismounted and was sitting his horse with the stillness of a man who'd been waiting for this day for 2 years. At Ada, whose expression communicated a complete sentence without using any words. At Pete Garner, who was looking at Doss with the particular attention of a man revisiting an old accounting. "The terms are straightforward," Doss said. He nodded to Pruitt, who opened the leather case. $600 by noon of the 90th day, which is today, which is now. In the absence of payment, the property reverts under the terms of the lease agreement. He looked at Jude. "Do you have $600? Before Jude could answer, a horse came through the gate from the north road, not fast, walking. The rider, a man in a black vest and white shirt with a leather satchel across his shoulder, the particular bearing of someone whose authority lived in documents rather than physicality. He dismounted in the yard and looked at the assembled people with the systematic attention of someone building a picture quickly. "Edgar Price," he said. "Territorial Land Office, Helena." He looked at Doss and then at Ruth. "I'm looking for Ruth Cawley, or Calloway." Ruth stepped forward from the porch. Price opened his satchel. He'd been corresponding with Ruth for 6 weeks. She'd written to the land office in Helena on day 18. Before the barn raising. Before the contract trap. Before the forge collapsed. She'd written because on day 12. Going through the small collection of things she'd brought from Texas in the battered trunk. She'd found the envelope her father had pressed into her hands the morning before he died and told her to keep, told her it might matter someday. And she'd always kept it without knowing what it contained, because he'd said to keep it, and she'd learned early that her father's instructions tended to be sound. Inside the envelope was a document, territorial homestead claim, Montana Territory, 1,867, filed under the name Thomas J. Cawley. And a surveyor's description that matched. When she checked it against the land boundaries Jude had shown her that first week, the exact parcel she was standing on. She hadn't told Jude. She hadn't told anyone. Because the correspondence might come to nothing and she'd learned the cost of hoping for things before they were confirmed, and she wasn't going to put that weight on him until she knew. Price spread the documents on the porch rail the way a man spread documents when he was confident in what they said. The original homestead claim, properly filed. The residency record, 3 years fulfilled. The improvement notes in Thomas Cawley's own handwriting listing a Smith's Forge as a permanent structure. A surveyor's record from 1869 showing the boundaries of the claim. And at the bottom, in the space for additional remarks. In handwriting that Ruth had looked at every day for 6 weeks. Intend to return for daughter Ruthie. Spring. He'd come here first. He'd built here first. He'd meant to come back and bring her. Thomas Cawley filed a valid homestead claim on this property in 1867, Price said. He fulfilled every legal requirement for ownership under territorial law. Upon his death in 1870, the property should have transferred to his sole surviving heir. He looked at Ruth. "That's you, Mrs. Calloway. This land has belonged to you since your father's death in 1000. 870 them. You just didn't know it. The yard was very quiet. Doss's land agent Pruitt had stopped moving. The leather case was open in his hands, but he'd stopped taking anything out of it. The deed I hold was purchased from the Morrison estate, Doss said. His voice had changed. Not collapsed. Not cracked, but changed in some register below the surface. Like a foundation stone settling. Legitimately purchased. Mrs. Morrison held no valid title to convey, Price said, with the mildness of a man who had said things like this before and understood their weight required no additional force. She took possession of an abandoned property without establishing legal claim. What she sold you was something she didn't own. Your lease agreement with Mr. Calloway is built on a deed that has no legal standing. He organized the documents. I have the originals on file in Helena. Certified copies here. Your attorneys are welcome to examine them. The finding will be the same. Ruth had come down off the porch. She was standing in the yard with Price's copy of the homestead claim in her hands, reading it in the morning light. Her father's handwriting. The name of the land listed in the surveyor's record was Cauley Creek. Had always been Cauley Creek. Jude had never known where the name came from. He'd inherited it from Morrison, who'd inherited it from the land itself, from the man who'd named it after himself because he'd meant it to be a place where his name was permanent. She turned the document over and found the additional remarks again. Intend to return for daughter Ruthie. Spring he built the forge, she said. Quiet, not to anyone in particular, to the document, to the yard, to the land under her boots that had been hers for 17 years without her knowledge. He came here and built everything, and then he went back to get me, and he didn't make it back. She looked up at the forge, at the collapsed east wall, at the structure she'd rebuilt twice on the foundation her father had laid. And I came here anyway, without knowing. And I rebuilt what he built without knowing it was his. Nobody spoke. Mateo dismounted and stood with his horse and did not say anything, which was its own kind of thing. Harlan Doss stood in the yard of a property he no longer had a claim to, and processed the situation with the visible calculation of a man checking exits. He was not a man who lost gracefully, but he was a man who understood when a position was untenable, and he understood it now. Ruth looked at him, not with triumph, with the focused directness she brought to work that needed to be completed. I want $200, for the interference with our coal supply, for the contract you sent through Warren Coal with the clause designed to take our equipment, for 6 weeks of deliberate obstruction. She paused. Pay it here in front of these people, or I provide the land office with a full written account of every incident. Mr. Briggs has offered to provide an independent account. From across the yard, Holt said nothing. He simply stood there, visible, which was the statement. Doss looked at the 41 people in the yard, at Price with his documentation, at Pruitt, who was now very carefully closing the leather case, having identified that his participation in today's proceedings was concluded. At Ruth, who was watching him with the patience of a woman who was willing to stand here as long as it took. He reached into his vest. He counted bills with the deliberate precision of a man controlling the one thing left available to him, which was the pace of his own defeat. He placed $200 on the porch rail next to Price's documents. Then he mounted his horse and he rode out of the yard with Pruitt behind him. And the gate closed. And the sound of hoofbeats faded north toward Clearwater Bend, and he was gone. 41 people in the yard. And then the sound started. Not organized. Not a cheer exactly. More the collective exhale of people who had been holding something tightly for a long time. Pete Garner made a sound that was half laugh and half something older and more private. Ada's older son said something to his brother in a low voice, and his brother nodded. Holt Briggs put his arm around Maggie, and she leaned into him with the ease of a woman who'd been given more time than she'd expected and intended to use it well. Mateo went to his saddlebag and took out his guitar. Ruth stood in the yard with her father's homestead document and $200, and the deed that made the distinction between Cauley and Calloway a matter of inheritance and choice simultaneously. And she looked at all of it. Then she looked at Jude. He crossed the yard to her. He didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that was equal to the moment. And he'd learned that the moments that mattered most were usually the ones that didn't require words from him. Just his presence and his willingness to be in them without looking for the exit. She handed him the homestead document. He looked at it, at Thomas Cauley's handwriting, at the name of the creek, at the additional remarks at the bottom. He built the forge for you, Jude said. He built it first. I built it twice more. She looked at the collapsed east wall. We'll build it a third time. Properly. All winter if we need to. Stone and mortar and get the foundation right from the ground up. Come spring it'll outlast both of us. We, he said. She looked at him. You have a problem with the word. I've been waiting for you to mean it. I've meant it since about day 3. The corner of her mouth moved. I was just waiting to see if you'd figure it out on your own. Behind them, Matteo began to play. Something slow and warm, the kind of music that made space for whatever people needed to do inside it. They married 3 weeks later on a Saturday when the sky had the particular clear cold of Montana in late November, the mountains sharp against it, the ground frozen but not yet buried. 43 people came, 2 more than had been in the yard on the 90th day, which meant the story had spread and brought additional witnesses. Ruth wore dark blue wool, cut by a seamstress in Clearwater Bend to her actual dimensions, which was the first time in her adult life that an article of clothing had been built for the person she was, rather than the person a pattern assumed she should be. It fit at the shoulders, it fit at the cuffs. She wore it with the ease of someone discovering that ease was available to them. Jude wore the good vest and a white shirt and had shaved with the careful attention he reserved for occasions. He stood at the front of the assembled people and did not brace for anything. When Pastor Ellis stepped back for their own words, Ruth spoke first. My father came to this land before I was born. He built something here and went back to get me and didn't make it. I came here anyway, without knowing, on a train ticket and a plan to survive, And I ended up on his land building in his forge and I didn't know any of it until 6 weeks ago, She looked at Jude with the focused attention she gave to things she was committing to permanently. I came here to start over. I didn't know that starting over meant coming home. And I didn't know that home was going to have you in it. A pause. I love you, I choose you every day. And I will be very difficult about the forge plans and you should have that information going in. Laughter, the real kind, the warm kind, the kind that happened when a group of people recognized a truth simultaneously. Jude said, I stood in the back of a room full of people who thought they were watching something funny and I saw something else. I saw a person who was still standing after everything that room was handing her, And I thought, if she can still stand, maybe I can too, I spent my last $2 on that thought. The best money I ever spent. The only money I've ever spent that I'd spend the same way again, knowing what I know now. Pastor Ellis read the closing words. Matteo played them. 3 of Pete Garner's neighbors fired their rifles into the cold air, because that was the custom and the custom existed for good reason. The sound of it rolling out across the valley and coming back changed by the distance. Winter came to the ranch the way it always did, with intention and without compromise. They built the new forge through the cold months. Just the 2 of them, the long work of doing something correctly after doing it twice under pressure. No rushing, no substitutions. Every stone placed and checked and placed again if it wasn't right. The mortar mixed at the temperature Ruth specified after 3 tests. The firebox designed on paper first, measured twice, built once. He learned her drawings. She learned that his 8 years of watching structures fail in Montana winters had produced knowledge worth listening to. They argued about the chimney height for 2 days, and arrived at a solution neither of them had started with, which was what the argument had been for. On a morning in late March when the snow had pulled back from the lower elevations and the ground was thinking cautiously about spring, Ruth lit the new forge for the first time. Jude stood in the doorway with coffee. The fire caught. The iron went to temperature. The hammer came up. The sound of it crossed the valley and came back larger than it left, changed by distance and cold air into something that had more resonance than a single hammer strike should reasonably produce. Like the valley had been holding it in reserve and was now returning it with interest. The first piece she made she set on the new work shelf without examining it. Then she picked it up and held it out. A door hinge, heavy-fitted, the kind made to outlast the door it would hang. For the 3rd room, she said. He took it from her, still warm. He turned it in his hands, feeling the weight of well-worked iron, the balance of something made by a person who knew what they were making and why. He looked at her in the doorway of the forge her father had built the bones of, and she had built 3 times and would build again without question if the need arose. The morning light came through the new roof ventilation at the angle she'd calculated in December, falling across the anvil exactly where it was needed. Before summer, he said, the full one, the one that went up and out and took the cold morning air with it, And he stood in the doorway of a forge on land that had been waiting 17 years to be found by the right person, holding a door hinge made by her hands, and thought that $2 silver had bought him everything he had not known he needed, which turned out to be in the end the only arithmetic that mattered.